Inching closer to the bush, Twilight made each hoofstep as silent as possible. She strained her eyes to see into the darkness and kept her ears pointed forward to pick up any sound that might clue her in on what was hiding there. The branches rustled again, but whatever animal was inside had yet to jump free. Twilight leapt, screamed, and galloped in the opposite direction of the bush before she dove behind a tree on the far side of the clearing. Her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest, and Twilight put a hoof over her ribcage in a panicked attempt to make sure that didn't happen. She began breathing deeply, trying to calm down while she looked up at the sky.
It was just the storm. It was just thunder. It was just thunder that scared me half to death, but it was just thunder.
As Twilight tried to calm herself, she began to hear something. It was soft at first, but as Twilight managed to calm her breathing, she began to hear the sound more clearly. It was crying. Some pony nearby was crying, and from the sound of the voice, it was a young filly.
Hello?
Twilight's ears swiveled as she tried to pinpoint the sound.
Is some pony there?
The crying quickly fell silent, as if the voice's owner was trying to hide. However, Twilight had been able to figure out the general direction it was coming from. She moved back into the forest clearing and continued to listen.
It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you.
Twilight heard no voice call back to her, and she could only sigh and shake her head.
I must have just imagined it.
She closed her eyes and began to prepare her teleportation spell. Again, the storm caught Twilight by surprise. It wasn't as bad as the first time. She was able to keep herself standing in the center of the clearing instead of galloping off to hide. She did, however, throw an annoyed glare up at the clouds for startling her twice. The thunder had also brought with it another sound, the crying Twilight had heard earlier, and it was close. Her first instinct was to call out again, but she decided against it in the fear of the pony falling silent again. Instead, Twilight swiveled her ears forward and listened. The crying was now accompanied by some rustling, and it took Twilight only a few minutes to pinpoint its source. It was the bush from earlier, the one Twilight had feared hid some horrible danger. More concerned about the other pony than the possibility of being attacked, Twilight crept over to the bush as quietly as possible. As she drew close, she reached out with her magic and began to carefully grasp at its branches. If whatever was inside the bush decided to run away, Twilight wanted to at least get a good look at it before it escaped. Once she was standing beside the bush, Twilight swallowed nervously and braced herself. She shoved the branches away and shut her eyes tight, a small part of her still expecting some pony in a cloak to jump out. When that didn't happen, Twilight cracked open her eyes and looked into the interior of the bush. What Twilight found, however, was nothing like she had expected. A filly as young as Applebloom was tangled up in the branches. It looked like she had been there for a few hours, if not longer. She also had nicks and scratches all over, which Twilight could only guess had been caused by the bush's long, sharp thorns. Normally, Twilight would have reached out to help the filly, but instead she found herself frozen in place. Her mind locked up, unable to process the filly's appearance. Her coat was a regal black. She possessed a long, rich purple mane that was currently tangled in the bush's thorny branches. And lastly, the filly had not only a pair of Pegasus wings, but a unicorn horn, making her an alicorn. Yet, it was the filly's eyes that held Twilight's attention and filled her with fear. Those eyes were not shaped like a normal pony's. The turquoise orbs, which should have had round pupils, instead had dagger-shaped pupils. The whites of her eyes were also off. Instead of white, they were a lighter color that closely resembled the color of the irises. Above all, they were eyes Twilight had seen before. They were the eyes of Nightmare Moon. Twilight felt her breathing quicken as her memory slipped back to the night before. The cult said they were the servants of Nightmare Moon, and they were obviously trying to cast some kind of spell. She'd admit she hadn't gotten a great look at the clearing, but she had seen spell lines, bowls with powders, and the spell they were attempting. It wasn't some simple bit of magic. To need that much setup, the spell had to be powerful, possibly the most powerful spell Twilight had ever seen. On top of that, they said that they were servants of Nightmare Moon. Yet, there was more to it than that. When they started to cast the spell, Twilight could feel it in her horn. The air became saturated with magical energy, and as the spell began to progress, the magic began to change, to feel familiar. It was a kind of magic she hadn't felt since... Twilight's pupils narrowed into fine points from the horror of the idea she had formulated. What if the spell cast was supposed to bring back Nightmare Moon? And what if it worked? It was insane. It was something that shouldn't work. Yet, how else could she have felt such a strong aura of magic in the air? Why else would a filly she had never seen before, an alicorn with such a strong resemblance to the infamous Mare in the Moon, be in the same clearing? Was that their goal? To resurrect Nightmare Moon? Did it work? Had the cult succeeded in bringing back Nightmare Moon? Was this Nightmare Moon? It had to be. There wasn't any other explanation for the intensity of the spell nor the appearance of the filly. That crazy cult had actually brought back Nightmare Moon, and Twilight had to warn some pony. Any pony. She had to write to Princess Celestia immediately. Or, better yet, she had to confront this thing before it could get away and hurt some pony. Even if she was the size of a filly, Nightmare Moon was a master of deception and trickery. As far as Twilight knew, this was all just a trick. The alicorn could have simply been attempting to lure some pony into a trap, lying in wait for some pony to get close before attacking. Twilight bristled, furrowed her eyebrows, and glared at the filly.
I know.
Twilight began harshly, only to stop abruptly. With just those two words, the filly shrank away whimpering, shutting her eyes as the bush's thorns left fresh cuts and scrapes on her body. When the filly dared to open her eyes again, she was looking up at Twilight like she was some hungry, pony-eating monster. Twilight had never had any pony look at her like that, and it caused her indignation to cool. She lifted her hoof and reached out as slowly as possible. The result was the same. The filly shied away, whimpered, trembled, and succeeded in injuring herself further on the bush's thorns. It was a reaction of pure fear. Twilight's brain did a flip-flop trying to process this. Nightmare Moon was one of the greatest threats to Equestria, second only to Discord himself. She was a monster that tried to, at best, scare Twilight and her new friends away, and at worst, get them killed. She was supposed to be the worst part of Luna's psyche brought to life. At least, that's what Twilight thought the insane cult spell was supposed to do. Yet, here she was, just a filly tangled in a thorn bush, and Twilight was unable to look away. The eyes that had once looked down on all ponies as if they were nothing but lowly insects were now filled to the brim with fear and pain. Some of the scratches from the bush were bleeding. The filly was terrified, hurt, and she needed help.
It's okay. I won't hurt you.
She wasn't at all sure of what she was doing, but she had to, at the very least, get the little filly out of the bush before she injured herself further. Taking hold of the bush magically, Twilight began carefully snapping away branches piece by piece. The filly winced a couple times during the process. Any small movement led to a thorn pricking her, but she kept her eyes locked on Twilight. The filly's eyes were still filled with fear, but behind that fear was a flicker of hope. Hope that the unicorn who had appeared was not a monster. A few minutes later, with a final snap, enough branches were cleared away for Twilight to gently levitate the filly out of the bush. She brought the filly Nightmare Moon out from the edge of the clearing and set her down in the center, where they both proceeded to stare at each other. Twilight's mind was spinning at 1,000,000 miles an hour, cycling through the same thoughts over and over again. Was this really Nightmare Moon? Was that the purpose of the spell last night? Did it work? How did it work? How could there be a Nightmare Moon without Luna? Weren't they one and the same? Why was Nightmare Moon so small? Did the spell not work? Was Nightmare Moon just trying to trick her into taking her back to Ponyville? Was she only pretending to be so small and helpless? Was she dangerous? Was this really Nightmare Moon? Round and round the thoughts circled. Twilight was unable to stop herself. It was the storm that finally managed to break the endless loop. Another wave of thunder cut through the air, snapping Twilight back to reality. Just as quickly, she noticed that the filly had rushed up to her. Trembling like a leaf, the filly clung to Twilight's leg, eyes shut tight. She was scared of the thunderstorm. Would Nightmare Moon ever be scared of a storm? Could she just be playing a trick, trying to lull her into a false sense of security? Twilight just couldn't be sure. Her mind was telling her that the filly couldn't be trusted, that she should just leave her in the forest, tell Princess Celestia, and let her deal with it. At the same time, if the filly was Nightmare Moon, Twilight couldn't just leave her in the forest. If she did, then there was a chance that the filly would disappear. No, if the filly was a danger to Equestria, Twilight had to keep track of her, if only to be sure she couldn't hurt any pony. That, and Twilight couldn't deny it didn't feel right to leave any pony alone in the dangerous forest, even a pony that was arguably an enemy.
Would you like to come back to Ponyville with me?
Twilight was unable to think of a better way to try and ask the filly to come along willingly. The little pony remained silent, but her eyes spoke her reply even before her head did. She nodded shakily and clung even closer to Twilight, looking upon her like she was the grand savior from a storybook. Twilight might have smiled at this if it weren't for the raindrops that were starting to fall on her head.
Oh, great.
Twilight flinched a bit as the rain started to worsen. With the storm coming quickly, Twilight did the only thing she could think of. She picked up the filly and nestled her between her saddlebags. Twilight then turned her magic above her head, projecting a transparent barrier just in time to shield them from the rain. Twilight then took in a deep breath and tried to cast her teleportation spell, but she couldn't get it to work. To teleport herself and others, Twilight used not only her magic, but also the magic that occurred naturally in Equestria. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't draw in enough magic from around her and the filly. The air had been leached dry of all magic, even though the evening before it had been oversaturated with mystical energy. Finally, Twilight was forced to give up. If she strained herself any further, she wouldn't have enough magic to power the barrier spell separating her and the filly from the rainstorm, nor enough energy to walk all the way back to the library. With a sigh, Twilight began to walk. She could only pray to herself that she'd get back before Spike panicked and sent a letter to the princess. Spike anxiously finished writing the letter to the princess and glanced at the clock to see it tick to the next minute. Twilight had been gone for 2 hours and 59 minutes. That left her with 1 minute, just 1 minute, to get back to the library before he sent his letter to Princess Celestia. Spike watched the clock anxiously before he dared to glance out the window at the raging thunderstorm. Dash had come by the library earlier to warn that the weather team was letting a storm from the Everfree Forest roll over Ponyville. The storm wasn't scheduled, but the weather team had decided to let it pass over to save themselves the trouble of preparing another just 2 days later. It made sense, but the storm was still pretty nasty. Thunder, lightning, wind, and pounding rain all came together at once, and Twilight was out in that weather, possibly hurt or even pony-napped. Spike glanced at the clock again and watched as the minute changed. It was official. It had been 3 hours and Twilight hadn't returned. Spike began to breathe in, the message to Celestia mere moments from being magically sent to Canterlot when the library door suddenly swung open.
Spike! Don't you dare breathe out!
Twilight pointed a commanding hoof at him. She was covered in mud and grime up to her neck, little leaves and sticks were caught in her mane, and a tired expression was on her face. Still, Spike couldn't help but smile. He tossed the letter aside and ran up to Twilight.
Where were you?
He would have hugged her leg, but he'd noticed how muddy she was.
In the Everfree Forest, like I told you. It just took longer to find my bags than I expected, and then I had to walk back in the storm.
She did her best to wipe her hooves clean on the welcome mat before stepping inside.
Why couldn't you teleport back? Did something happen? Are you okay?
Yes, I'm fine. There was just something wrong in the forest. I couldn't get a strong enough magical charge to teleport. It was like almost all the magic had been sucked out of the air. I'll be fine. All I need is a bath and some dinner.
Well, then you go straight upstairs and take a bath. I'll make dinner. How about some soup and sandwiches?
Can you make it celery soup and daffodil sandwiches?
Twilight levitated the books from her saddlebags and placed them in Spike's waiting arms.
Of course. 1 order of celery soup and daffodil sandwiches coming right up. After I get these books put away.